welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
We're glad that you've tuned in to join with us today. I'm here with Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi David, and Rabbi Toby, and we're going to have a conversation similar to conversation we had recently, where at the end of our podcast, we may not have answers, but we'll have more questions and more things to contemplate, to think about. And what we're wanting to talk about is actually forgiveness and redemption and how that really looks in the body of Messiah. You know, we look around us, and if you read the newspapers, especially over the past few years, we've seen a lot of cases in which we've seen leaders fall for various reasons, whether it's embezzlement, whether it's abuse of power, whether it's sexual immorality, whatever happens. We've also seen a large number of leaders, whether in Messianic Judaism or Christianity, that have committed suicide as a result of their or response to their actions, to being caught in their actions. And then each of us have people in our communities, and not just the Congregation Maim Chaim community or the Bradam community, but each of our individual communities, where we have people who are within our body, who are there with us, whether they're brand new or they're people that have been there for a while, who for some reason or another fall into sin or came to Messiah having been involved in blatant, outright sin that we would have concerns about, whether it's sexual morality, abuse, drug abuse, violence, all kinds of things that go on. And how do we look at this through God's eyes, through the eyes of the Scripture, through an understanding that a repentant person is made new and whole, and that if we ask for forgiveness, God is not only faithful to forgive us, but to cleanse us, while at the same time having concern for our flocks, for our sheep, for the people in our congregation, having concern for the person themselves, having concern maybe for the family or the people involved in the situation. All of these things become a much bigger conundrum for us to deal with. Now, I want to start out by saying that we're talking beyond the legal limits. For instance, if there is a court injunction against somebody, we're not saying we should ignore the court injunction because of forgiveness or because of grace or whatever. We had a case one time where we had a man who was coming to our synagogue, and he'd been coming for quite a time to our synagogue, and one of our young people happened to invite this man's son, who had a separation order, a restraining order. He couldn't be in contact, no contact order. That's the. Mm-hmm. So the son didn't know his father was attending the synagogue, and the man had no idea that the son was being invited to the synagogue by one of his school friends. And so all of a sudden we're in a situation where we have two people that want to worship God in our synagogue, both from pure hearts, both from a desire to worship. And who do you choose? Who stays, who goes at that moment? What do you say, okay, the man is going to stay because he's been coming regularly and he's invested in part of the community? Or do you say, here's a young person who may not know Messiah at all or may not have a relationship with him, that's going to have the opportunity to hear about him, and how do we decide? Now, I'm not talking about obeying the injunction, because that was a given. One of the people had to leave, but how do we as leaders make a decision based upon the belief that we have in the restorative work, the redemptive work of God, while at the same time protecting our flocks, protecting the people involved, and protecting the person that was involved, because there are times where somebody had been actively involved in something, maybe drug addiction, maybe they went to jail for theft or tax evasion or whatever, But then they came to the Lord, and all of that is in their past. Do we as leaders have any responsibility at all to tell his story, to tell her story, to share? And is there where does this become gossip? Where does this righteousness? How do we engage in this as we do this? And this is a real thing that we deal with as leaders on a regular basis, because every person that attends our synagogue, including us as leaders, are fallen people who were born in sin, shapen in iniquity, and have now been reborn through the working and power of the atonement of Messiah. So we want to just have a conversation about this, and we're not going to be naming names of people. We're not going to be calling out individuals, but this is a real thing. How far does the forgiveness of God go? Are there limits to how we respond to a repentant person, to their forgiveness in Messiah, and so on, beyond the legal? For instance, again, we talked about if there's somebody who is not allowed to be with children because of something they did in their past, we're not going to violate a court order in order to have them come to our congregation. There are certain people that are just going to have to watch from home or watch online or wherever they are to be a part of, because of choices they made in their past that are still affecting their life. We're talking about situations that are outside the scope of a legal injunction or something that would be that way. So I just want to throw out, what do you guys think? What do you guys? And I know Rabbi David is going to share a little about some resources and where we find resources, or what resources are there, what are good, or even if we look at them. So you guys just jump in and share what your heart is and what you think.
I think that this is Rabbi Toby. I think it depends on the situation. I think if there's legal, I think you might have already covered that in your intro, but I think if there's something legal involved, the church or the synagogue definitely has to submit to the authority of the government, and that's in the scripture. I have some experience with things like this over the years. I grew up in the church till I was like in my 20s, but I've been in Messianic Judaism since I was 25, and I'm 43 now, so it's been 18 years. So I haven't seen everything, but I've seen some stuff. Let me give you a scenario of something that I witnessed that I think is a problem. Because here's what I'll say for the outset. Whatever you decide to do as a leadership, if you're a pastor or a rabbi, in this case, we'll say it as a rabbi because we're speaking from a Messianic perspective. But whatever you're deciding to do as a leader, you have to understand that whatever decision you make regarding someone or someones in your congregation, you have to apply that to everybody.
Right.
You have to be prepared if you make a decision that it has to apply to everyone. Because there's a situation that I saw some years ago where a married couple was attending congregation, and there was they started to experience problems. And based on the information that the leadership had gotten, the problems were emanating from the husband. I think there was some marital unfaithfulness there. The wife was in shambles, falling apart. I think the husband had left and was just doing whatever he wanted. And then they were both attending the synagogue. Now, after it all came out, what was happening, and they split up, well, the wife continued to attend, and then after a period of time, the husband started showing up by himself. And in the midst of all this, leadership decided to ask the man to leave. He couldn't come. He was told that he couldn't come back because he had not sought forgiveness. He had not said that he was wrong. And when he would walk into the door, it would make the wife just, she would just fall apart because he was coming in and he was sitting down and he was acting like nothing. And he wasn't sitting with her.
Right.
He was sitting like across the way.
Right.
But he was acting like nothing was wrong. He was acting like he didn't do anything when he kind of torpedoed his marriage. So he was asked to leave. And what's the problem with that? I think that's normal. The problem is there was a lady in the synagogue who went through the same thing, and her husband, or her ex-husband, and his newer wife, had been attending for some time, and that didn't happen with them.
Interesting.
What's the difference, might you ask? Well, the ex-husband and the wife were friends with people in leadership. And I know for the woman who witnessed all this happen with this woman and her ex-husband, it was dealt with decisively. She was like, well, wait a minute. What about my situation?
Right.
Now, so that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, in our earlier conversation, when Rabbi David brought up policies, I think that it's important for us to have policies in place of how we're going to deal with the majority of issues, so that we handle everybody with equal weights and measures.
Right.
So that,
I'm sorry.
Because
what that is, I just want to say, what that is what happened at Eyewitness. That is what I call a homegrown approach to a problem, when I think what happens is, and I think it happens if you've been a leader of a congregation that was small and it grew. Because you see, when a rabbi or a congregational leader starts a congregation, unless he's transferring into, but if you're starting a congregation from the ground up, like from the grassroots, you're generally there with 5 people, and then 10 people, and then 20, and then 30, and then 40, and then maybe back down to 30, and then 40, and then 50, and then 70, and then 100, and then 200. But if you're not adapting how you're handling interpersonal issues as your congregation's growing, if you're still handling 200 people like they're 20, you are going to have such severe, colossal, chaotic issues. You cannot. We learned that recently at our own congregation. I'll use us as an example. And David knows about it, because when we had our Sukkot celebration, our big camp out, we had like 100 people there at one point. I mean, not 100 people camped, but some people come and go home.
Right.
But we had a lot of people there. We had I think it was the most we'd ever had, I think, camping.
Yeah, I don't think it was quite 100, but it was definitely a lot of folks.
I'm just talking about if you include the in and out, it's a lot of people. We realized this year that we have got to have some policies in place, because, and when I mentioned it to David's wife, the Rebbitzin, Danny, I said, Danielle, and she immediately, because Danielle's very wise, she says, you're right, there's not 10 of us out here anymore. So we have to have some top-down policies, right, because we had some issues arise. You cannot handle 100, 200, 300 people like they're 10, 20, 30 people. So, and that just goes into what Rabbi Eric said about, because it's this homegrown approach. And that's a homegrown approach, which is, these are my friends. I'm not going to treat them that way. But those 2 people over there having marital issues and the husband's being inappropriate, well, he just needs to go. Well, what about these people? Well, no, they have dinner with you. They go to Wild Wings with you. That's the problem.
Right.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and it becomes a thing where, is it my family? Is it my friends? Is it my leadership team? Is it someone that I don't mind if they leave, or is it someone that I don't want to leave?
Yeah.
These are real things that we deal with, that unless we have a set policy that says this is what happens.
Right.
If this and I think that's why Matthew 18 is written in there. If somebody is involved in a sin, you go to them one-on-one. Then the next step of the policy, you go to them with 2 other witnesses. And then if they don't repent, then you ask them to leave the congregation. That's a biblical policy for congregational correction,
right,
that is written, that needs to be equally applied to everyone, regardless of their who it is.
So I think part of this conversation, because we talk about this from time to time. The name of our podcast is the MessianTics Podcast, and one of the things that we try to focus on is what are some of the crazy things, or some of the antics, some of the specific to Messianic Judaism issues that need to be addressed. And not everything is like a negative thing or whatever, but the reality is Messianic Judaism as a whole, and especially in the congregational life aspect of that, is very reactive rather than proactive. And part of that, I think, is two-part. And we talked about some of this earlier before we started recording. Part of it is two-part. Part of it is that most Messianic synagogues, and Rabbi Toby kind of touched on this a little bit, most Messianic synagogues are 40 people or less in attendance, right, and will stay there for their entire existence. That 40 people may rotate. They may have 5 or 10 that are there forever, and then the rest rotate. But it's 40 people or less their entire existence, and there's reasons that kind of tends to be a thing as opposed to growth. But that's a whole other day's discussion too. But the reality is that because Messianic Judaism tends to be a thing in which we don't necessarily equip and send people out to start congregations, but rather people realize a need and just do it without any real help or structure or foundation or equipping or anything like that. And we also tend to be very tribal. What's ours is ours, and we don't often equip it into it. We don't go, hey, we figured out this really great system, these really great policies and procedures that work. Can we just give this to you? We don't just put it out there, right? As an example of this, in the other direction, is Rabbi Eric does a 6-week Hebrew class, and the premise to it is teach anybody to read Hebrew in 6 weeks, and that's right. It, right? And so he does it online. It's a Zoom meeting or whatever, and he's had some really good success with it. A number of people have gone through it. He's got different layers of it for intro and or beginning and intermediate and so on, and what have you. And I told him a few months back, we were chatting, I was like, hey, now that you've had some time to see how this plays out, you should package this and give it to other Messianic rabbis. Not, because it is something that is a kind of a lack of a better way of wording it, a side hustle for him. He does charge for the classes because his time is in it. He's putting energy and effort into it. Right. And I said, you should take this and package it and give it to other Messianic rabbis that they can then do the exact same thing, add a little extra income into their own family's pockets, but also further their congregation's reach and so on, which is something he's working on. But I say all of that to say that we are not necessarily great at going to other and say, hey, we have a great system, here we go. But also part of that is that because we're reactive and because Messianic Judaism is still small and is trying to segment ourselves out as not being another church or not being the church, like we're going back to what the first century was and what have you, we often are afraid of using the church's experience and knowledge and policies and programs they've developed out of fear that, hey, that's their thing. We're doing our own thing. It doesn't fit here, right? And so we have often this fear of gleaning from the church, because what does the church have to offer us? Like, we know better. We know it all. What does the church have? And honestly, the church has a lot to offer us. In fact, one of the resources that Rabbi Eric mentioned I was going to throw out there is from Church of the Highlands in North Alabama. Well, they're all over Alabama, but North Alabama, think what you want to think about Church of Highlands. I don't really care. That's between you and God or whatever. That's not an issue. What I'm suggesting to you, to our audience, especially if you are a leader of a Messianic congregation, is Church of the Highlands is very good at policies and procedures. They have worked up a tremendous, very successful system and systems for their church over years of experience and effort and growth and so on. If you go to resources.churchofthehighlands.com, and I will link it in the show notes, resources.churchofthehighlands.com. Highlands Resources is what this site is called. It is all of their resources, all of their documentation, all of their policies and procedures that they use over the years. Glean from it. Take what you think is beneficial and leave what you think may not be alone. But use these resources. They are free. It's a free login for you and your congregational staff. Free login. Use whatever you want. They've got videos to implement. They've got short courses to teach you how to do this. it is very effective. That doesn't, just because you're taking something and gleaning something from a mega church doesn't mean you're trying to make your synagogue a mega synagogue. And not that there is or isn't anything wrong with that either, but that doesn't, just learn. Like Rabbi Toby and I talk about it a lot. We're working at the moment on trying to develop a B'nai Mitzvot program, like intentional courses and such for our congregation. And one of the things that when we first started talking about it that I said was, look, I have zero desire to reinvent the wheel. There are people that already do this and do this well. Let's just find what they use, take it. We will rebrand it for our stuff. Give them the credit if want. That's fine. I don't care. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's already people that are doing it well. Let's just glean from them. And I think I'm part of a generation of Messianic rabbis that we're comfortable with that.
Yeah, we actually, and we're going to share our B'nai Mitzvot
first thing
policy.
Tomorrow morning.
No.
And
actually,
first thing tomorrow morning, the next morning. No.
I contacted the lady who's in charge of our B'nai Mitzvot program, and her curriculum is not in a position where she can just share it, so she's rewriting it so she can get it so that it's actual followable instead of just personal. But we have, at our congregation, we have policies for our worship team that we share with whoever calls and asks for it. We have policies for our dance team. We have policies for our Shabbat school.
For food.
For how we do our food and our own egg team. We have all of those things which we readily share with whoever wants them because we bounce them. Now, we don't expect anybody's going to use them word for word as we do, but it gives you a document you can work from to adapt. Same thing with our bylaws, the bylaws that we wrote for our synagogue. We make them available to whoever wants them. Now, they may adapt them to fit their community, but at least they're not starting from scratch and trying to find everything. And one of those things that we're talking about in this redemptive, in this forgiveness, in this restoration thing, is that we live in a world where background checks are a requirement, especially for running. Nobody works with our children unless they've gone through a background check. But we also gleaned from not only other congregations, synagogues, and churches, but also universities and businesses to come up with a policy for background. How are we going to deal with it? What is our... For instance, let's say you have somebody that comes in and you have a policy that says you can't work with our children if you've ever had a drug offense. Well, that sounds really easy, but what if you have somebody who's 60 years old that's been living for the Lord for 45 years, but when he was 15... he got busted with marijuana that's now legal
depending on where you are.
In many states. And so if you do a background check far enough, you find his arrest for marijuana, and that makes it that this person is no longer qualified for serving in your community because he had an arrest for a drug offense way back when he was 15. So when you set a policy, you have to set a policy. We're going back X amount of years. We're going back for these. We're looking for these certain things.
Right.
These are so that you know what it is, and then you can apply that policy across the board to everyone. Where you might have somebody who just got out of jail for being a drug dealer, and they would not qualify, but if you didn't have a policy, they would be treated equally to somebody who was 15 when they had a drug offense and now they're 60, and they've been walking with the Lord for 45 years and it hasn't been any kind of issue. So you have to have these tools, these policies, and again, as Rabbi David said, there are people that have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to have lawyers help them to write policies that are good policies that you can glean from rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. And the advantage of gleaning from those people that have prepared in advance is there's a lot of things that you might not even think of that they've already documented and went through to use. And these things help us to then be fair in how we deal with things. How do you deal with divorced people? How long does someone have to be divorced before they can be used in your congregation? How long do they have to be, or can they be remarried after the divorce? And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people, for instance, and this happens all the time is you have a couple in your congregation that are dating. You have a man and a woman that are dating in your congregation, and they break up. And now they have hurt feelings. And neither one of them want the other one to be in synagogue.
Who keeps the congregation?
Right. Who gets, who you know, they broke up. Who gets custody of the congregation?
So we're going to develop a prenup for dating and courting individuals,
right? Well,
in case one of you decides to.
Well, it just the thing is, you have to have a policy in place for handling these things, because these are real life issues that come up that we need to be aware of before they happen.
Right.
Because if we're trying to react to them instead of being proactive, we're going to make bad decisions and hurt people.
Yeah, and those do cause problems, because there was a young couple at one of the congregations I attended that dated, and they broke up, and it was acrimonious. I don't know.
Awkward.
It was, yeah, but the problem is that it was they were teenagers, like
Right.
17, 18 is what I mean.
Right.
They were teenagers. They broke up, and the awkwardness between them became a feud between their respective families. Mm-hmm. And it not only tore through the congregation,
Yeah.
they were fighting on the Israel trip.
Yeah. I didn't
go
could
on,
be a whole,
but it was a whole thing.
it could be a whole nother
Yeah.
conversation. But I'm a big fan of if you're going to be here at this particular congregation, whichever one, people say oh, you can't interfere with people's dating lives or whatever. I'm like, yeah, you can. You can say you can at least teach. Here's how we advise you parents to lead your children in dating and courting relationships that will result in, even if it doesn't produce a marriage, it will result in a just parting ways, and there won't have been such a
soul tie.
Yeah, such an emotional attachment that results in these feuds that are really unnecessary.
And I think the key is having a leadership team that's all on the same page. Like, for instance, if there's a long-standing issue between a couple people, or if there is some long-standing issue, if there's some kind of issue that the rabbi knows about, or an elder knows about, or somebody knows about, and it's not, I'm not talking about little things like, this person gets on this person's nerves and they kind of had an awkward interaction. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about if there's a long-standing interpersonal problem in your congregation, if there's a person that's behaving inappropriately or something like that, the leadership team has to be on the same page. You can't have a long-standing issue going on and the rabbi knows about it or an elder knows about it, and then something blows up, and none of the other leadership team knows about it, And I told my story before we hit record about how I was having an issue with a person, and I told one member of the leadership because I was following the chain of command, but because they didn't share it, this was a long-standing issue. When something happened, it was a member of the worship team. When I had to ask this guy to step down, everybody else was like, well, Toby flew off the handle and pulled the trigger on this guy, and that, so there has to be, everybody's got to be on the same page. But you got to have the leadership team. Everybody has to be on the same page. Everybody has to, for instance, I'll give you another just example of one time when I was in a security team meeting, and what is the most common thing? I'll just pose this question: what is the most common thing that's going to happen in a synagogue?
In a security issue?
In a security issue.
It's a domestic violence situation.
All right. Are you going to have a man with what's more likely to happen? Are you going to have a man come in with an AK-47, or are you going to have someone's child try to crawl up on stage in the middle of a worship set? What's more common?
The latter.
Someone's child.
Right, the child, right? I remember bringing that up in a security team meeting because we had a particular family when I was the worship leader. The kids were getting up on stage, and the mom was just standing there and smiling like she was, like I can tell, I'm like, okay, this kid paints on the wall and you think it's a Picasso. Like that's the kind of parent we're dealing with. Just like, oh, wow. instead of realizing this kid's disrupting the service. When I brought that up as the worship leader at this congregation, the response is, we're not talking about things like that. We're talking about serious threats. And I'm like, the most common thing for you to deal with are weekly disruptions.
Right.
So everybody's got to be on the same page. And you can put somebody on that. You can put somebody on eliminating distractions, and you can have somebody on larger threats. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's just nobody wants to deal. It's I think a bigger overarching issue is you have people in leadership and congregations right now that don't like dealing with problems. They don't want to deal with problems.
Right.
Which is why they don't have policies, because policies recognize problems.
Or at least the possibility that something could happen someday that nobody forethought.
Right.
Yeah.
So kind of what you're saying is, in order to have forgiveness, redemption, and restoration within a congregation, you have to have a method and a system
Yes.
for leading to that. It can't just be an off-the-wall, like, oh, brother, we forgive you,
Yeah.
whatever it was.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
And
We have people, I'm sorry.
And let's be honest, it's not like that is a far-fetched reality, because we've got an entire book called the Bible that is almost exclusively policies and procedures.
Right.
You know, Rabbi Eric brought up Matthew 18 earlier, which is
Right.
the policies and procedures for fixing relationships, right? We go to Galatians 6. I know, God forbid we use scripture, but we go to Galatians 6, right? Brothers and sisters, verse 1, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught doing something wrong, or you who are directed by the Ruach, by the Spirit, restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness, looking closely at yourself, so you are not tempted also. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the Torah of Moses. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he is fooling himself. Rather, let each one examine his own work. Then he will have pride in himself alone and not in comparison to others, for each one will carry his own load. Paul makes it very clear that it's necessary for restoration, right? But obviously there are boundaries. Like we talked earlier, you know, if you've got an individual in the congregation or wanting to be in the congregation who, you know, God forbid, you find out is a sex offender, like, and you know, there are varying levels of that, you know, and what have you. But God forbid he's let's just assume he's the worst kind of sex offender. Like how he got out of prison, nobody knows. But worst kind of sex offender, he's on a lifelong offenders list, can never get off of it, right? I believe in perfect faith in restoration and redemption, that God's desire is to restore and redeem everyone, right? But I also understand that there are still earthly consequences to our actions, right? And so if you're in that situation, you can't be mad at a congregation if they tell you, hey, here's our website. You can watch our service online from home. Please do not be here in person. We have children. We have too many children. You're not able, not that there's too many children, but, you know, you cannot be here. Why? Because as Rabbi Eric said, there are legal guidelines for how you now have the option of living your life. And I'm not trying to be mean to you. I'm not trying to push you away. I'm not trying to reject you. I'm not trying to say that you're not worthy of redemption. You are. And I want to see that in your life. But you cannot be in this building or at any of our in-person events because this is a problem. This is a choice you made. That's
Right.
you know, and that's not to crap on anybody or anything like that. It's just this is a reality. We make choices. Those choices have earthly consequences. Yes, redemption, forgiveness, you know, salvation, all available. And in God's eyes, those things are gone when we repent. He's taken care of them. But that doesn't mean that they don't still follow us here on earth that we have to still deal with.
Right,
here's-
and we have people that we deal with that are like that these are people that the law precludes from attending our congregation. There are other people, for instance, at our congregation, we have people that used to be drug dealers, but there's no prohibition or legal ramifications. We have people that were in various aspects of adult entertainment that are members of our congregation. They're part of our congregation. We have people that were homeless, that, you know, all kinds of things. We have people that were in jail. We have people, there's a whole plethora. And we have people that are from all kinds of things. And when we look at somebody, we have a predetermined in our minds sometimes which sins are worse.
Yeah, we want to zero in on.
We want to zero in. So somebody who was a shoplifter, we look at differently than somebody who was in the adult entertainment Somebody who sleeps with a woman we look at differently than a woman who got pregnant out of wedlock. We have different ways that in our humanity we look at these things, but through faith in Messiah, through biblical ethics, we can't look at those things differently in that way. We have to look at those things as these people are forgiven and then welcomed into our community, and we have to defend their redemptive life against accusations just as we would anybody else, as if it was our children or our grandchildren that were being accused of these things.
Yep, and equal weights and measures doesn't mean that every single situation is equal
Because
and can
they're
be
not.
weighed and measured against every single. But I will say this: I have learned over the years that redeemed and restored former unlicensed pharmaceutical representatives have some of the coolest fireside stories. Just throwing that out there.
I believe it.
I was in a meeting one time, just a side note, where a DEA agent and one of the people he was investigating they both had become born again. He was no longer a DEA agent. The other guy was no longer an unregistered pharmaceutical distribution agent. And now they had become friends.
Is that a drug dealer?
Yes.
Yes.
But they had become friends in the faith. But they were both sitting at a
Right.
table talking with each other about what God had done in their life and the miracles. But they were also talking about their history together pre their born again experience.
Right.
The previous chase.
Right. It's an interesting. They were running the race before, and now they're running the race after. But different end game.
So here's a question I'll pose with regards to particularly those individuals who the law actually may prevent them from being around, let's say, children per se. Because let's not pretend we don't have some of those. We do. We have several people who are fit in that camp. Do we? Should we? Could we provide a ministry, almost like a prison ministry, but on the outside of prison, like prison ministry, but on the other side of prison, on the other side of the cell, to folks like that, like meeting spaces, Bible studies, even smaller, shorter versions of services, to those individuals. And granted, most congregations are never going to see more than a handful of at a time. But if you're in a big city,
Unfortunately,
area,
most congregations never know how many they actually have
that's true
seen.
too. Sometimes, but if you're in a big city area, big metropolitan area, it's possible you may have a good, dozen even folks who may fit in that category. So, I think that would be another question of policy. Could you provide something like that?
One of the things I've seen some congregations do, and again, this goes back to gleaning from churches. One of the things I've seen some churches do is they'll say, look, you can't be at our in-person services. However, our midweek Bible studies, there are no children. You're welcome to come to those.
Right.
Men's events, there are no children. You can come to those. That kind of thing, where they're still including them or leaving room for inclusion in community life.
Right.
But in terms of their experience with the service aspect, the congregational service aspect, you can watch online. If you want to get a viewing party of people together so you can feel like you've got community, that's fine. I would say to your question, I don't think it's necessarily a terrible idea to come up with something like that, but much like prison ministry, it's got to have the right person or right people running it.
Oh, sure.
And it's one of those things that I think what ends up happening, especially in the small congregation atmosphere, which, small congregations realistically anything 200 people or less, right? What tends to happen in the small congregation atmosphere is when the community wants to launch something new, a new program, a new ministry, a new whatever, it's the pastor or the rabbi's job. It's the family of the pastor or rabbi's job. It's, it kind of falls on, everybody expects them to do it. But the reality is it can't be something that just falls on the pastor or the rabbi's shoulder. It's got to be something that, there are people.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And if you're going to do it, you have to make sure that you you need to talk to lawyers and figure out what's the best way to establish this. How
Right.
can we safeguard our community, safeguard our name, safeguard this, and do intentional intensive training
glean
with those
programs from other people that have done this.
Yeah,
Right.
do intentional intensive trainings with
Yeah.
those that are going to be operating in that specific spirit ministry to protect them. Because there are plenty of people who find redemption and forgiveness, but never find deliverance, right?
Sure.
And it's a personal choice that that's the case, but it is a thing that happens, that they never truly break free of the spiritual bondage they've been in. They've found forgiveness, repentance, and maybe they strive really hard to maintain. And so there is a spiritual warfare aspect of that, that you also have to train that ministry team and be covering that ministry team in prayer with regards to and care for them. Like, if that is a very intense atmosphere to be in,
Right.
and if you've got people there, now it may not be the rabbi or pastor's job to be the one doing that, but it is their job to make sure on a regular basis they're doing mental health checks and such on those individuals, and spiritual life checks and discipleship and what have you. To make sure that they're okay, that they're doing good, that they're walking. Same thing's true for people in prison ministry.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we forsake that. Congregations will develop prison ministries, which are great, but what are you doing for the life of those in that ministry?
Right.
Is it, come on Saturday or Sunday and you get filled up in the worship service, or is there something more intentional that's being done to sow into them as well?
Right.
Because that is though it's a very worthy and admirable ministry outlet, it is also a very, very spiritually draining and mentally hard thing to do. I've been there. I've done it. It is not always the easiest thing in the world to do.
Yeah, deliverance ministry, that stuff is very, very challenging and draining. One of the reasons that, not the only reason, not the primary reason, but one of the reasons that teaching restoration and forgiveness and all is important as we deal with it with our community is that if we don't establish policies and discipleship to people where they understand how this works, there's going to come a time where it's the leader that does something that is looking for forgiveness, and I'm not
or
talking
is accused
about,
of something,
right? Or accused. But I'm talking about somebody. I'm not talking about like falling into adultery or becoming a drunk or an alcoholic or whatever. But some decision they made that wasn't the wisest, wasn't the best, and then you go and ask for forgiveness. You want to receive forgiveness from your congregation, from your community. I'll give you an example that happened just last week. We had a guy that came to our synagogue last week to visit. He'd been there before, and he looked exactly like somebody we had thrown out of our congregation because he was harassing the women in our congregation. He was dressed like it, wore the same hat, looked very much like. So our safety team met him at the door and said, "Look, you've been asked not to be here." Well, it turned out it wasn't that guy.
Oh, gosh.
It was a different guy who just looked very, very much like him. Well, I had to, as the rabbi, reach out and say, "I'm sorry, we made a mistake. We were wrong. We made a bad decision. Our safety team, out of honest intent, did this." And so I reached out to him to do that. Now, if I expect, because I'm going to make mistakes, our safety team is going to make mistakes, our teachers are going to make mistakes, our worship leaders, people are going to make mistakes. But we can't expect our congregation to understand how to forgive and have a restored relationship if we don't have policies and set in place and act on it with them to where they experience it, so then they can give it back when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think policies, as you mentioned, Rabbi Eric, go a long way. For instance, when Brooke, and again, I'll use this congregation as an example, when Brooke took over the worship team last year, it's like one of the first things I told her. I said, "You are going to need to come up with some policies, because what happens if you don't? I remember having to do the same thing when Brooke and I led worship together. I'm not involved in the worship team, but when we led worship together, there had to be policies. The reason why is if you don't, well, people will think they can skip practice and still play on Shabbat morning. People will do things like, I had a guy, when I emailed music out to the group, he would email corrections to the group, but would not include me on the loop, and those kinds of things, all the way down to someone may dress inappropriately on stage, those kinds of situations. So you have to have things in place, because if you don't, and it has to be that, for instance, in youth there's an age requirement, and people age out of youth, and sometimes they try to come back, or you'll have people 22 years old wanting to be in youth group, and so you have to have these policies. And I remember a pretty serious one is that when my mother, we were at a congregation, and she was put over the women's counseling ministry, and the synagogue paid for her phone, and she was given a synagogue for women's counseling phone. Here's your phone, go to it. That's it. So what was happening? Well, my mom didn't have any specifications, parameters. That's it. She didn't have any parameters, so she would have counseling sessions with women that were going for 4 hours.
Oof.
Women were calling her at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. When my mom was asleep, which most human beings are at 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, when she wouldn't pick up the phone, she'd wake up the next morning to angry texts from these hurting women who were like, "Where are you when I need you?"
Right.
And so what did my mom start doing? She started answering the phone at 2, 3, 4 in the morning.
Oh, gosh.
And it got to a point where I had to advocate for her. I said, "Hey, this is what's happening to my mother." And I can't even have a normal conversation with her,
right,
because she's so, it got to, and I'll tell you to this day, my mother will not keep her cell phone on her, and I guarantee, and I know it's because of that. And the response was, "Whoa, wait a minute. Whoa, what? Okay." In other words, let's park the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. A person has fallen. Let's just load them up and take them to the morgue, So it was, well, sessions only need to be an hour. Women can't call your mother until after 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. and things like that. Oh, yeah, we need to do this. And I'm like, she had been doing this for months. So that's what I'm saying. Like, leadership can't assign somebody to a task or put someone over a ministry and not have policies.
Right.
And not only that, again, as I said earlier, policies that adapt as things, as more people walk into your doors. You cannot deal with 5 people, with 20 people like you do 5.
Yeah.
And,
And with that, when you're setting up policies for new things, you sit down with for instance, your mom, staff should sit down with her and say, "Okay, we're putting you in this role. So what do you need from us? How can we equip you? What can we do for you? What are the parameters you see would be beneficial? Are there, include that individual in those, especially if it's a new ministry that the congregation's never had to think about before, right? You don't just throw somebody to the wolves and then hope they float and that's it. Hope that they survive, right? The same is true that as those policies kind of materialize, as the needs of the ministry evolve, and those the fluidity to developing policies occur, you don't retroactively punish people for policies that didn't exist because something new came up that you finally had to consider and needed to put into place.
Yeah, and in those policies, you need to actually have policies for entry. For instance, if you're going to start a counseling ministry, then you might want to put a policy that says you have to be a licensed family counselor in order to be in this ministry. If you're on the worship team, like our worship team, there's a 4-month entry, or
it should be.
to get in. You start out by sitting for a month and watching the worship team practice and being at the practice and seeing how things go. And then the next month you're there and you can start doing a little more and involving and doing that. But we've had people over the years, now this has been a long time ago, somebody came up and said, hey, I just bought a harp and I'd like to be on the worship team. and I said, well, how long have you played the harp? I don't. Well, then you can't be on the worship team until you learn to play, and those kind of things. So there are guidelines for entry. The on-ramp to get into a ministry should have guidelines so that people know this is the expectation just to be a part of this. The same way that we have membership requirements that are in policy. You have to read these books and do this and do that. And I cannot tell you the number of times that I've had people say, I don't really like to read. Do I have to read those books in order to be a member? Yes, you do. Those kind of things. It's just setting a policy that then becomes the way everything operates. And that way, if something doesn't happen right, you have a policy standard to set it against all the way through what's going on in the ministry. And it allows you to then also set meters in place that demonstrate fruits of repentance for people that are being restored.
Yeah, and I remember one time. I remember when we first, at one of my congregations. It was when I first became a worship leader. We had a situation where we had just built the worship team, so it very much was very kind of, we were like a family, But again, started having some problems with people being, running late or just not showing up to practice and stuff and things like that. Or
as families do.
Yeah, as families do. So I started to put some things in place. And one guy came up to me and said, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, man, if we're not going to run this thing like a family, I'm out of here. And I'm like,
deuces.
I mean, what's the problem with having some rules? Because the fact of the matter is, if you can't follow rules from people you see, that means you're probably not following rules from the God you can't.
Right.
And not only that, but families have rules.
Yeah.
Like I've got kids, and we have rules for our kids. There are things they're allowed to do and things they aren't allowed to do. There are places they're allowed to go and places they aren't allowed to go. Right. And same is true between my wife and I and how we interact with our kids and whatever. Like, there's nothing wrong with rules and policies. Right. And there should be a humility to recognize the value of submitting to those policies if you're going to be a part of something. I mean, we had somebody years ago that came to the synagogue. They called us up and said, hey, I'm moving down from Michigan. I feel like God told me to come to this congregation. Can I come visit? Yeah, absolutely. So he comes and visits, and our membership process was a little different back then, and we would make an announcement every week. If you're interested in membership, see Rabbi David. He'll tell you what the process is. And he comes up to me afterwards. He goes, Rabbi, I'd like to talk to you about membership. What do I need to do? And so I laid out a membership process for him, and he goes, oh, I've got to wait 4 months before I can ask for membership. I was like, yeah, it gives time for you to get to know us and determine if we're a good fit for you and vice versa. And he goes, but Rabbi, I feel like God told me to come here. Like, he gave me this congregation by name. I feel like why do I have to wait to be a member if this is what God told me to do? I said, are you telling me you don't think God knew what our membership process was when he told you to come here? And that was the last we ever saw him. But the reality is we have to be willing to be humble and submit. If God is directing us towards something, if he's directing to be on a worship team, be humble and submit to that worship team. Right. If there's a time frame that they want something done, you do it in that time frame. Mm-hmm. If you are joining the Chazanim team, if you're joining security, if you're joining Shabbat school, if you're joining whatever it is, don't get offended because you have to do the exact same things that everybody else on that ministry team does. And as the time progresses and things evolve and leadership realizes there's needs to add new structure and organization and policies and procedures, don't be offended like they're coming at you because everybody is held to the same standard. And so just be patient and be humble and be willing to submit. If God puts you in the community you're involved in, trust that God's in control. And if you have questions, hopefully your rabbi, your pastor, your leadership are approachable and are willing to sit down and talk with you. So I'm sure that there are far more questions to be had, far more conversations to go through with regard to this issue, but this is at least a way that we can get this conversation started and rolling. And with that, please again take advantage of resources that are available from congregations, from churches, from Messianic synagogues that are already out there. Again, resources.churchofthehighlands.com, resources.churchofthehighlands.com. I personally have a number of rabbis that I personally glean from, that on a regular basis, when I'm thinking about something new, thinking about adding something in, we'll call them up or email them and say, hey, I'm interested in doing this. Is this something you already do? Awesome. How do you do it? Because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I just want to glean from. So please, if you don't have that network, if you don't have those trusted people you can lean on, build that network. Plug yourself in. If you're not part of a congregational organization, if there's not a covering over your community, whether it's a denomination or it's an association or whatever, find one. There is so much value in being in community with others doing what you do and being able to glean from and benefit and bless into it as well. So with that said, thanks for joining us, and we will talk with you guys again next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.